After 3 weeks in the hospital, all I wanted was to turn my key and sleep in my own bed. But when I got home, the key wouldn't turn. And on the other side of the door was my daughter-in-law, wearing that fake smile, telling me she had changed the lock for security reasons. In that moment, I felt like I no longer knew anyone in my own family. The Uber pulled up to the familiar white picket fence that Margaret had painted every spring for the past 37 years. Each post, each gate hinge, each flowering dogwood in the front yard held decades of memories. After 3 weeks in Mercy General Hospital, breathing the crisp October air of Maplewood should have felt like coming home. The scent of burning leaves from neighboring yards mixed with the distant sound of the Methodist church bells chiming 6 o'clock, a symphony of suburban familiarity that usually brought her peace. But something felt wrong. Margaret paid the driver with hands still shaky from surgery, watching him unload her small overnight bag from the trunk. The 2-story colonial house, with its hunter green shutters and the wraparound porch where she'd spent countless evenings in her rocking chair, seemed unusually quiet. No lights glowing through the lace curtains, despite Jennifer promising she'd be there for her homecoming. "You sure this is the right address, ma'am?" the driver asked, noticing her hesitation as she stood at the gate. "Yes, this is home," Margaret replied, though uncertainty crept into her voice. She'd lived at 42 Elm Street since 1987, when she and Robert had bought the house with their first dual income. Every maple tree lining the sidewalk, every crack in the concrete where tree roots had pushed through, every neighbor's mailbox was as familiar as breathing. The driver waited until she reached the front steps before pulling away, his taillights disappearing around the corner past the Hendersons' house. Margaret climbed the 3 wooden steps to her wraparound porch, noting that the fall mums she'd planted in September were thriving. Someone had been watering them. The American flag hanging from its brass holder fluttered gently in the evening breeze, and everything looked exactly as she'd left it, that panicked morning when the ambulance had rushed her to emergency surgery. Everything except for one crucial detail. Margaret inserted her house key, the same brass key she'd carried for over 3 decades, into the deadbolt. It wouldn't turn. She jiggled it, thinking maybe the lock was sticking from the recent rain. Nothing. She tried the doorknob lock below it. The key slid in, but refused to rotate. "That's odd," she muttered to herself, trying both keys again with more force. The keychain held her car key, house keys, and the small silver cross Robert had given her on their 20th anniversary. She'd never had trouble with these locks before. Just as panic began to flutter in her chest, the porch light clicked on, bathing her in warm yellow light. Through the frosted glass sidelight, she could see movement inside. The door opened with a cheerful jingle of the bell Jennifer had hung there last Christmas. "Oh, Margaret, you're early!" Jennifer stood in the doorway, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing yoga pants and an oversized Northwestern University sweatshirt. At 34, she still carried herself with the nervous energy of someone trying to prove herself worthy of belonging to this family. Her smile seemed bright, but strained around the edges. "Early?" Margaret checked her watch, a simple Timex that Robert had bought her decades ago. "You said 6 o'clock when you picked up Tommy from school yesterday. The church bells just finished chiming." "Right, of course. I was expecting you closer to 6:30. Jennifer stepped aside, gesturing for Margaret to come in, but something in her posture seemed guarded. "How are you feeling? You look great. Much better than when we visited last week." Margaret stepped into her own foyer, and immediately something felt off-kilter. The antique umbrella stand her mother had given her was moved 3 feet to the left. The small Persian rug that usually lay perfectly centered was askew. Even the family photos on the console table seemed rearranged. Her wedding portrait was now behind 8-year-old Tommy's school picture instead of prominently displayed in front. Why didn't my keys work? Margaret asked, still holding them in her palm. Jennifer's laugh came out too quickly, too high-pitched. Oh, that. Well, while you were in the hospital, we had some break-ins in the neighborhood. The Kowalskis 2 streets over, and Mrs. Chen. Next door said someone tried her back door last Tuesday night. Michael thought it would be safer to change the locks temporarily. You know, just as a precaution, while the house was empty. Margaret studied her daughter-in-law's face. Jennifer had always been a poor liar. Her left eye twitched when she wasn't telling. The truth, a tell Margaret had noticed during the early years of her marriage to Michael. The eye was twitching now. Break-ins? In Maplewood? Margaret had lived in this neighborhood through the crack epidemic of the 90s, the economic downturn of 2008, and even the recent uptick in property crimes during the pandemic. Maplewood had always been the kind of place where people still left their garage doors open and borrowed cups of sugar from neighbors they'd known for decades. I have the new keys right here, Jennifer said quickly, pulling a small brass key from her pocket. I was going to give them to you tomorrow when you were more settled. Margaret took the key, noting that it was shiny and new, without the worn spots and tiny scratches that had accumulated on her original keys over the years. The metal felt cold and unfamiliar in her palm. "Where's Michael?" she asked, looking around the living room. Her son usually got home from his job at the insurance office by 5:30, and he'd promised to take the afternoon off for her homecoming. He got held up at work. Big case closing tomorrow. He'll be home by 7, maybe 8 at the latest. Jennifer was already moving toward the kitchen, her voice drifting back over her shoulder. "Are you hungry? I made that tuna casserole you like. Well, I tried to. I couldn't remember if you use regular noodles or egg noodles." Following Jennifer into the kitchen, Margaret felt another wave of displacement. The ceramic canisters she'd arranged by height were now organized by color. Her collection of vintage salt and pepper shakers, usually displayed on the windowsill above the sink, was nowhere to be seen. Even the kitchen towels were different. Jennifer had apparently replaced Margaret's practical white cotton towels with decorative ones covered in autumn leaves. "Where are my things?" Margaret asked, running her fingers along the clean countertop, where her coffee maker used to sit. "What things?" Jennifer opened the refrigerator, avoiding Margaret's gaze. "My coffee maker, my spice rack, the salt and pepper shakers from my grandmother." "Oh, those! They're all safe, don't worry. I just reorganized a little while you were gone, made some space. The coffee maker is in the pantry. I thought you might want to use the Keurig I bought. It's so much easier, especially while you're recovering." Margaret opened the pantry door and found her 30-year-old Mr. Coffee sitting on the top shelf, pushed behind boxes of cereal and bags of flour. The cord was wrapped neatly around the base, and it looked somehow abandoned, like a forgotten relic in her own kitchen. "I prefer my coffee maker," Margaret said firmly. "I've been using it every morning since 1994. "Of course. Absolutely. I'll get it down for you tomorrow. I just thought, well, the Keurig is right there on the counter, all ready to go." The Keurig sat where Margaret's coffee maker had lived for decades, sleek and modern and completely foreign. Next to it was a carousel filled with colorful pods, French vanilla, hazelnut mocha, pumpkin spice, flavors that Margaret had never purchased. As Jennifer busied herself with dinner preparations, Margaret noticed other subtle changes. The kitchen table was set with unfamiliar placemats, geometric patterns in teal and gold instead of her grandmother's embroidered ones. A new succulent garden sat in the center of the table, where her ceramic fruit bowl usually resided. Even the refrigerator magnets seemed different, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what was missing. "Tommy's upstairs doing homework," Jennifer said, pulling the casserole from the oven. "He's so excited you're home. He made you a welcome back card in art class." At the mention of her grandson, Margaret felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. Tommy was 8 years old, with Michael's serious brown eyes and Jennifer's quick smile. He'd been her constant companion during weekend visits, helping her tend the garden and listening to stories about his grandfather Robert. who had passed away 5 years earlier. "I should go see him," Margaret said, heading toward the staircase. "Actually," Jennifer called after her, "he's in the middle of a video call with his class, some group project thing. Maybe give him another half hour?" Margaret paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking up toward the second floor, where she could indeed hear the faint sound of voices from Tommy's room. But something about Jennifer's tone made her suspicious. In all her years of being a grandmother, she'd never been asked to wait to see Tommy. Usually, he came barreling down the stairs the moment he heard her car in the driveway. "I think I'll rest in my room for a few minutes," Margaret said, climbing the first few steps. "Margaret, wait." Jennifer's voice had a sharp edge now. "I should mention, I've been using the master bedroom while you were in the hospital. I hope that's okay. My back has been killing me, and your mattress is so much better than ours. I can move my things back to the guest room tonight, if you prefer." Margaret stopped climbing. Her bedroom, the room she'd shared with Robert for 22 years until his death, the room where she'd grieved and healed and learned to sleep alone, had been occupied by someone else. She could see Jennifer's yoga mat rolled up at the top of the stairs and a pair of expensive-looking sneakers she didn't recognize. "You've been sleeping in my bed?" Margaret asked, turning to face Jennifer. "Just temporarily. I thought since you were going to be in the hospital for a while, and Michael's been working such long hours, it just made sense." Jennifer's hands twisted the kitchen towel she was holding. "I washed all the sheets with that lavender detergent you like. Everything's exactly the way you left it." But as Margaret climbed the rest of the stairs, she discovered that wasn't true either. The hallway walls, once lined with family photographs, spanning 4 decades, now displayed only a select few. Her wedding photo was gone, replaced by a larger print of Tommy's recent school portrait. The antique console table where she kept her jewelry box and Robert's reading glasses was bare except for a small potted plant she didn't recognize. At the doorway to her bedroom, Margaret stopped and gripped the frame. The room looked like a guest suite in a hotel. Her personal photographs had been cleared from the nightstands. Her romance novels were missing from the bookshelf. Even Robert's cologne bottle, which she'd kept on his dresser as a small memorial, was nowhere to be seen. Jennifer appeared behind her, slightly out of breath from climbing the stairs quickly. "I packed up some of your personal things to keep them safe," she said. "They're in boxes in the closet. I can unpack them tomorrow if you want." "My personal things," Margaret repeated slowly, "in my own bedroom. I just thought, while you were recovering, it might be easier to have a clean, calm space, less clutter." Margaret walked to her dresser and opened the top drawer. Empty. The second drawer contained only a few items of her clothing, mixed with unfamiliar undergarments that clearly belonged to Jennifer. In the third drawer, she found her nightgowns, folded neatly, but they smelled like a perfume she didn't wear. "Where are my things, Jennifer?" Margaret's voice was steady, but underneath lay a growing current of something she hadn't felt in years. Anger. "They're safe. Everything is completely safe. I organized everything, made some space. You know how small these old houses are." Margaret turned to face her daughter-in-law fully. Jennifer was 34 years old, had been married to Michael for 9 years, and had always been respectful, if somewhat anxious. But standing in the middle of Margaret's bedroom, wearing clothes that were clearly unpacked and settled, she looked less like a temporary caretaker and more like someone who had moved in permanently. "How long were you planning to stay here?" Margaret asked. "Stay here? I don't understand. I've just been looking after the house while you were gone." Looking after it or living in it? The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Jennifer's face flushed pink, and she clutched the towel tighter. Michael and I thought it would be good for someone to be here, for security, and to keep things maintained." "And your apartment?" "Our apartment? Where you and Michael live. Where you've lived since you got married. Jennifer's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. That is, our lease was up. When? When what? When was your lease up, Jennifer? The church bells chimed 7 o'clock, and in the silence that followed, Margaret could hear her grandson's voice upstairs, still engaged in his video call. The sound of a neighborhood dog barking, the familiar creak of the old house settling. Last month, Jennifer finally whispered. The truth hit Margaret like a physical blow. While she'd been lying in a hospital bed, fighting through emergency surgery and a difficult recovery, her son and daughter-in-law hadn't just been house-sitting. They had moved in, permanently, without asking, without even telling her. Last month, Margaret repeated. So you moved into my house while I was having surgery. It wasn't like that. We were going to talk to you about it when you felt better. Michael has been so stressed about the lease renewal, and we thought, temporarily, just until we could find something else. But Margaret was no longer listening to Jennifer's stammered explanations. She was thinking about the changed locks, the rearranged furniture, the missing personal items. She was thinking about how Jennifer had seemed surprised by her early arrival, as if Margaret were a guest returning unexpectedly to her own home. For the first time in 3 weeks, Margaret felt completely awake. The fog of pain medication and recovery lifted, replaced by a clarity that was both illuminating and terrifying. She was 72 years old, had just survived major surgery, and was standing in her own bedroom being treated like an intruder. The betrayal wasn't just that they had moved in without permission. It was that they had erased her presence, packed away her life, and made themselves comfortable in the space she had created with her late husband. It was that when she had been most vulnerable, most in need of family support, they had seen an opportunity instead of a responsibility. I want you out, Margaret said quietly. Margaret, please, let me explain. I want you out of my bedroom. I want you out of my house. Tonight. Jennifer's face went pale. You don't mean that. You're tired. You're confused from the medication. I am not confused. Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. I am not tired, and I am not a fool. Get your things out of my bedroom. Now. The sound of footsteps thundered down the hallway, and Tommy appeared in the doorway, his face bright with excitement. Grandma Maggie, you're home! He threw his arms around her waist, and for a moment, the anger receded as Margaret hugged her grandson tight. Hi, sweetheart, she whispered. Into his hair, I missed you so much. I missed you too. Mom said you might have to stay in the hospital longer, but I told her you were tough. Dad says you're the toughest lady in the whole neighborhood. Over Tommy's head, Margaret met Jennifer's eyes. The younger woman looked panicked, caught between her son's innocent joy and the growing storm she had created. Tommy, Jennifer said carefully, why don't you go finish your homework? Grandma Margaret needs to rest. But she just got home. Can't we have dinner together? I made her a welcome home card. It has glitter. We'll have dinner, Margaret said firmly, still looking at Jennifer. Just the three of us. Your mother has some things to pack. The evening that followed would become a defining moment in their family's history, though none of them understood it yet. As Jennifer gathered her belongings with sharp, angry movements, and Tommy chattered about school and friends and the Halloween costume he wanted to wear, Margaret sat in her rocking chair on the front porch and realized that her real recovery was just beginning. The house at 42 Elm Street had been invaded, not by strangers, but by family. And somehow, that made the betrayal cut even deeper. The first night back in her own bed should have been a relief, but Margaret lay awake until nearly 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of her house. Every creak of the floorboards, every whistle of wind through the old windows, every distant rumble of a late-night truck on Route 9 felt different now. The house that had sheltered her for over 3 decades suddenly felt like foreign territory she was trying to reclaim. Jennifer had packed quickly and silently, stuffing clothes into garbage bags with the efficient desperation of someone executing a tactical retreat. Michael had arrived home at 8:30 to find his wife loading their belongings into their Honda Pilot, while Tommy sat on the porch steps, confused and increasingly upset about why Mommy was crying. The confrontation between mother and son had been brief and brutal. "Mom, what the hell is going on?" Michael had demanded. His tie loosened and his usually neat brown hair, disheveled from what Margaret could now see, was probably stress rather than just work. At 37, her son still had the earnest face that had made him popular with teachers and coaches. But tonight, his expression held something she'd never seen before: resentment. "I came home to find my locks changed and my bedroom occupied," Margaret had replied, standing in her doorway with her arms crossed, "without my knowledge or permission. You were in the hospital for 3 weeks. We were taking care of your house. By moving into it permanently, by packing away my belongings, and rearranging my furniture?" Michael's face had flushed red, the way it used to when he was 12 and caught in a lie. "Our lease expired. We needed somewhere to stay temporarily while we looked for a new place." "Temporarily," Margaret had repeated, "with changed locks, and my personal items stored away like I was never coming back." It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like, Michael? Explain to me how living in my house without asking is taking care of it." The argument had escalated from there, with Jennifer crying in the driveway, Tommy asking increasingly frantic questions about whether Grandma was mad at him, and neighbors beginning to peer out from behind their curtains. It had ended with Michael loading the last of their belongings into the car and driving away without saying goodbye, while Jennifer had pressed a spare house key into Margaret's palm with trembling fingers. "I'm sorry," she had whispered. "I never meant for it to happen like this." But sorry wasn't enough to explain away 3 weeks of calculated deception. Now, lying in sheets that still smelled faintly of Jennifer's lavender body lotion, Margaret made a mental list of everything she needed to investigate. The changed locks were just the beginning. If Jennifer had been living here for weeks, treating the house as her own, what else had she done? The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical October weather in Connecticut that matched Margaret's mood perfectly. She made coffee in her reclaimed Mr. Coffee pot, savoring the familiar ritual of measuring grounds and listening to the percolating sounds she'd missed in the hospital. The Keurig sat unplugged on the counter like a rejected gift, its cheerful red and chrome finish somehow accusatory. While the coffee brewed, Margaret began her investigation. In the living room, she discovered that Jennifer hadn't just rearranged furniture, she had replaced several pieces entirely. Margaret's favorite reading chair, a worn but comfortable recliner that Robert had bought her for their 15th anniversary, was gone. In its place sat a trendy accent chair in mustard yellow with geometric patterns that made Margaret's eyes hurt. Her collection of Robert's Civil War books had been replaced by what appeared to be a carefully curated selection of contemporary fiction and self-help books about living your best life. The dining room revealed more invasive changes. Margaret's china cabinet, which had held her mother's wedding dishes and a collection of crystal glasses accumulated over decades of anniversaries and special occasions, now displayed completely different items. Sleek white dishes with gold rims, modern wine glasses, a set of silver-plated serving pieces that Margaret had never seen before. Her mother's dishes, hand-painted spode with delicate blue roses, were nowhere to be found. In the kitchen, Margaret opened every cabinet and drawer with growing alarm. Her everyday dishes were relegated to the highest shelves, replaced at eye level by Jennifer's more modern alternatives. The spice rack she had organized alphabetically for 20 years was now arranged by color, and half the spices were ones she'd never purchased: turmeric, sumac, za'atar. Her collection of cast iron pans, seasoned to perfection over decades of use, had been pushed to the back of the cabinet to make room for a matching set of non-stick cookware still bearing price tags. But it was in the basement that Margaret made the most disturbing discovery. She rarely ventured into the basement anymore. Her arthritis made the stairs difficult, and there wasn't much down there except storage and the washer and dryer. But something nagged at her about the missing items upstairs, and she wanted to check if Jennifer had simply moved things rather than discarded them. The basement was clean, too clean. The concrete floor had been swept and mopped recently, and the familiar musty smell was overlaid with the scent of bleach and pine cleaner. But what caught Margaret's attention immediately was the far corner where Robert's workbench used to be. For 22 years, that corner had been Robert's domain. His pegboard with carefully organized tools, his coffee can full of various screws and bolts, his collection of woodworking projects in various stages of completion. After his death, Margaret had left everything exactly as it was, unable to face the finality of packing away his things. Now the corner was empty, except for 2 large banker's boxes and a small stack of plastic storage bins. With trembling hands, Margaret opened the first box. Inside, wrapped in newspaper, were her mother's dishes, each piece carefully cushioned, but relegated to storage like items in an estate sale. The second box contained her photograph albums, her jewelry box, Robert's cologne bottle, and the small ceramic figurines that had decorated their bedroom for decades. The plastic bins held Robert's tools and the unfinished birdhouse he'd been working on the week before his heart attack. Everything that made the basement his space had been cleaned out, organized, and stored away like the contents of someone who had died. Margaret sank onto the bottom step of the basement stairs and began to cry. Not the gentle tears of missing Robert or the frustrated tears of dealing with Jennifer's betrayal, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal. They had erased him. While she was fighting for her life in a hospital bed, they had systematically removed every trace of her husband from their shared home. The sound of the doorbell interrupted her breakdown. Margaret wiped her face with her sleeve and climbed back upstairs, wondering who could be visiting at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. Through the front door's peephole, she could see her neighbor, Dorothy Chen, holding a casserole dish and shifting nervously from foot to foot. Dorothy lived in the blue house next door and had been Margaret's closest friend since the Chens had moved to Elm Street 12 years ago. She was also the neighborhood's unofficial information network, somehow always knowing who was getting divorced, who was struggling with teenagers, and who needed a meal during difficult times. "Dorothy," Margaret said, opening the door. "What a nice surprise." "I brought you tuna casserole," Dorothy announced, thrusting the covered dish forward. "And I need to talk to you about what's been happening while you were in the hospital." Margaret led Dorothy into the kitchen, noting how her neighbor's sharp eyes immediately cataloged the changes in the room. Dorothy had been in this kitchen hundreds of times over the years, sharing coffee and gossip and occasionally helping. With holiday meal preparations, if anyone would notice that things were different, it would be Dorothy. "That's a new coffee maker," Dorothy said, pointing at the Keurig. "Jennifer's," Margaret replied. "She's been staying here." "Staying here or living here?" Dorothy's tone was carefully neutral, but Margaret could hear the underlying concern. "What do you mean?" Dorothy set down her purse and looked directly at Margaret. "Honey, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm asking because I care about you. Did you give Jennifer permission to run a business out of your house?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. "What business?" "She's been having people over, groups of women mostly, every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon for the past 2 weeks. They park all up and down the street, and they stay for about 2 hours. Last Thursday, I counted 8 cars. Margaret felt the room tilt slightly. What kind of business? I'm not sure. I asked my friend Linda. You remember Linda? Kowalski from Pine Street? And she said Jennifer approached her at the grocery store about some kind of beauty consulting thing. Makeup and skincare for women over 40. Linda said Jennifer told her she was launching a new career in cosmetics and was hosting introduction parties. In my house. In your living room, from what I could see. She moved all your furniture around, brought in some kind of portable lighting setup, and had all these women sitting in a circle like it was a formal presentation. Margaret gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. And you didn't think to call me? I tried. I called the hospital 3 times, but they said you were only taking calls from immediate family. I assumed you knew about it. Dorothy's voice grew smaller. Margaret, I thought you had given her permission. The pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. The rearranged furniture wasn't just Jennifer making herself comfortable. It was Jennifer creating a professional space for her business. Venture. The new dishes, the carefully curated books, the modern accent chair, all props for creating an upscale atmosphere to sell cosmetics to middle-aged women with disposable income. Did she charge them? Margaret asked. I don't know for sure, but Linda said something about a starter kit fee. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to process the magnitude of the betrayal. It wasn't just that Jennifer had moved into her house without permission. She had turned Margaret's living room into a commercial space, using Margaret's home as a business location while Margaret was recovering from surgery. There's more, Dorothy said quietly. I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I think you need to know. Tell me what? Last week, I saw Jennifer talking to a real estate agent. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Margaret opened her eyes and stared at Dorothy, certain she had misheard. A real estate agent? Cynthia Morrison from Coldwell Banker. I've used her myself, so I know her car. She and Jennifer spent about an hour walking around your property, and Cynthia was taking notes and pictures. Margaret sat down heavily in one of her kitchen chairs. Pictures of what? The house, the yard, the garage, all the things you'd document if you were preparing a property for sale. The implication was staggering. While Margaret was in the hospital, had Jennifer been exploring the possibility of selling Margaret's house? Did she think Margaret was going to die? Or had she and Michael been planning something even more sinister? Dorothy, Margaret said slowly, I need you to tell me everything you saw while I was gone. Everything. For the next hour, Dorothy recounted 3 weeks of observations that painted a picture of systematic takeover. Jennifer had not just moved. She had established dominance. She had changed the exterior house numbers from the classic brass ones Margaret had installed to modern black numbers. She had replaced the American flag with a decorative autumn banner. She had even planted new flowers in the front. Beds, replacing Margaret's carefully tended perennials with trendy fall mums and ornamental kale. I thought it was odd that she was making so many changes, Dorothy admitted. But Michael told my husband that you had asked Jennifer to update things while you were recovering. He said you wanted the house to feel fresh for your homecoming. Another lie. Margaret had never expressed any dissatisfaction with her home's appearance. She had chosen every element carefully over the years, creating a space that reflected her and Robert's life together. The idea that she would want it updated was absurd to anyone who actually knew her. But the most disturbing revelation came at the end of Dorothy's report. There's one more thing, Dorothy said, glancing toward the window as if checking for eavesdroppers. Yesterday morning, I saw a moving truck here. A moving truck? One of those small U-Haul trucks. Jennifer and Michael were loading furniture into it. I assumed they were moving some things to make room for your return, but now you think they were moving my things out permanently. I don't know what to think. But Margaret, if I were you, I'd check very carefully what's missing from your house. After Dorothy left, Margaret began a systematic inventory of her home. The process was both methodical and heartbreaking. In addition to Robert's workshop equipment and her mother's dishes, she discovered that several valuable items were simply gone. Her grandmother's antique sewing machine, Robert's collection of first-edition military histories, the silver tea service that had belonged to Robert's mother. Even her own jewelry was diminished. Her pearl necklace and Robert's class ring were missing from the jewelry box Jennifer had packed away. Some items might have been moved for safekeeping, but others appeared to have been stolen outright. Margaret found herself making 2 lists, missing and sold. The second list grew longer as the day wore on. By late afternoon, Margaret had called her insurance company to document the missing items and was considering calling the police when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Michael's name. "Mom, we need to talk." "Yes," Margaret said. "We certainly do." "Not on the phone. Can I come over tonight? Jennifer wants to apologize properly, and we need to explain some things." "Explain what things, Michael?" "Just, things got complicated while you were in the hospital. There were circumstances you don't know about." Margaret looked around her disrupted home, thinking of her missing belongings and the U-Haul truck Dorothy had seen. What circumstances could possibly justify what you've done? "Mom, please, just give us a chance to explain. We never meant to hurt you." That evening, as Margaret waited for her son and daughter-in-law to arrive, she sat in her reclaimed living room and tried to prepare herself for whatever lies they were going to tell. The autumn rain continued to fall against the windows, and the house felt both familiar and foreign, like coming home from a long trip to find that someone had been living your life while you were away. She had no idea that the worst revelations were still to come. When Michael and Jennifer arrived at 7 o'clock, they brought Tommy with them, which Margaret recognized as a strategic move. They knew she wouldn't lose her temper completely with her grandson present. But they also brought something else, a folder full of documents that would turn Margaret's understanding of the situation completely upside down. "Mom," Michael said, settling into the uncomfortable geometric chair that had replaced her recliner, "we need to tell you about Dad's debts." Margaret felt the room grow cold. "What debts?" Jennifer opened the folder with trembling hands. "The ones he hid from you, the ones that are going to cost you your house." Margaret's hands went numb as she stared at the folder Jennifer held. Outside, the October rain had intensified, drumming against the windows with increasing urgency, as if nature itself was responding to the tension crackling in her living room. Tommy sat cross-legged on the carpet, building something with Legos he'd brought from his backpack, blissfully unaware that his world was about to shift again. "What are you talking about?" Margaret's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Robert didn't have any debts when he died. I handled all the estate paperwork myself." Michael leaned forward in the geometric chair, his elbows on his knees in the posture he'd adopted as a child when delivering bad news, like the time he'd crashed his bicycle into the Hendersons' prize-winning roses. "Mom, Dad was hiding things from you. Significant financial problems that he kept secret." "That's impossible." Margaret's response was automatic, defensive. She and Robert had shared everything for 22 years. Every bank account, every investment decision, every major purchase was discussed over morning coffee at their kitchen table. They had been partners in every sense of the word. Jennifer pulled out a stack of papers from the folder, her movements careful and deliberate, like a lawyer presenting evidence in a crucial case. "These are credit card statements we found in his desk after he died. You never saw them because they were being sent to a P.O. box." The documents Jennifer spread across Margaret's coffee table looked official and damning. Credit card statements from companies Margaret had never heard of: Discover, Capital One, American Express, all bearing Robert's name and showing balances that made her stomach lurch. $15,000 here, $12,000 there, $8,000 on another card. The numbers swam before her eyes as she tried to process what she was seeing. "This is impossible," Margaret repeated, but her voice wavered now. "Robert never had these credit cards. We used our joint visa for everything." "Look at the signatures, Mom," Michael said gently, pointing to photocopied signatures at the bottom of various charge slips. "Look at the addresses where the statements were sent." Margaret picked up one of the statements with shaking hands. The address was a mailboxes etc. location 3 towns over in Brantford, a place she'd never been, had never heard Robert mention. But the signature on the application, viewed through the plastic sleeve Jennifer had carefully placed it in, was unmistakably Robert's careful cursive handwriting. "I don't understand," Margaret said, though even as the words left her mouth, pieces of a horrible puzzle began clicking into place. Robert's occasional errands that took longer than expected, his insistence on handling certain mail deliveries himself, the way he'd sometimes seemed distracted or worried, claiming it was just stress from his job at the power plant. "There's more," Jennifer said softly, producing another set of documents. "These are loan papers from First National Bank. He took out a second mortgage on the house 18 months before he died." Margaret's vision blurred. A second mortgage. On the house she'd assumed was paid off completely, the house that was supposed to be her security in retirement. "How much?" she whispered. $95,000. The number hit her like a physical blow. She sank back against the sofa cushions, feeling as though the room was spinning around her. $95,000 in debt that she'd never known about, secured against the house that was supposed to be her legacy to Michael and Tommy. "Why?" Margaret asked. "Why would he do this?" Michael and Jennifer exchanged a look that Margaret caught despite her shock. There was something else, something they hadn't told her yet. "Mom, do you remember Dad's friend Jerry from the plant? Jerry Kowalski?" Margaret nodded numbly. Jerry had been Robert's supervisor for 15 years, a loud, jovial man who attended their summer barbecues and always brought too much beer. "What does Jerry have to do with this?" "He had a business opportunity," Jennifer said carefully. "Something about investing in a restaurant franchise. Dad put money into it." "How much money?" "All of it," Michael said quietly. "Everything he borrowed. Jerry convinced him it was a sure thing, that they'd make back triple their investment within 2 years. Margaret felt something cold and terrible settling in her chest. What happened to the restaurant? It never opened. Jerry disappeared with the money 6 months before Dad died. Went to Florida, from what we heard. Dad had been trying to track him down, trying to figure out how to recover the investment without telling you what had happened. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Tommy's Legos clicking together and the rain against the windows. Margaret stared at the papers scattered across her coffee table, trying to reconcile this picture of Robert as a secretive, foolish man with the husband she thought she'd known and loved. "How do you know all this?" she asked finally. "Dad's desk," Michael said. "After the funeral, when you asked me to help clean out his workshop, I found a locked drawer. Inside were all these papers, plus a notebook where he'd been trying to figure out how to pay everything back." Margaret remembered that day. She'd been too grief-stricken to handle going through Robert's personal belongings, so she'd asked Michael to pack away the tools and workshop equipment while she dealt with the funeral arrangements. She'd trusted him to handle it sensitively, to preserve anything that might be meaningful. "You've known about this for 5 years?" Margaret's voice was rising now, cutting through her shock. 5 years? And you never told me?" "I didn't want to hurt you," Michael said defensively. "You were grieving, and I thought maybe I could figure out a way to handle it without you ever having to know." "Handle it how?" Michael's face flushed. "I've been making minimum payments on the credit cards, trying to keep them current so they wouldn't come after the house." "With what money?" "My savings, Jennifer's income from her part-time job." We've been scraping together about $800 a month for 5 years, trying to keep your credit from being destroyed." Margaret's mind reeled as she calculated the numbers. $800 a month for 5 years was nearly $50,000, money her son and daughter-in-law had spent protecting her from her husband's mistakes. The magnitude of their sacrifice began to sink in, followed immediately by the realization of what it meant for their current situation. "You're broke," she said. Jennifer nodded miserably. "We've been living paycheck to paycheck for years. Our lease expired last month, and we couldn't afford to renew it. We were going to be homeless. So you moved into my house." "Temporarily," Michael said quickly. "Just until we could figure something else out. By lying to me about changed locks and break-ins in the neighborhood." "We were trying to protect you," Jennifer burst out, her composure finally cracking. "You were having surgery, and we didn't want you to worry about financial problems. On top of your health problems. We thought we could handle everything quietly, and then explain later, when you were stronger." Margaret looked at her daughter-in-law, really looked at her for the first time that evening. Jennifer's face was drawn and pale, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of months or years of sleepless nights. Her clothes were clean but worn, and Margaret noticed that her wedding ring was missing. "Where's your ring?" Margaret asked. Jennifer's hand instinctively covered her bare ring finger. We had to sell it. Last year, when Michael's hours got cut at the insurance office." The pieces of the puzzle continued to fall into place. Michael's frequent overtime that never seemed to result in extra income. Jennifer's part-time job at the department store that supposedly didn't pay much but kept her out of the house for hours at a time. The way they'd always declined Margaret's invitations to dinner out, claiming they preferred home-cooked meals. "The beauty business," Margaret said suddenly. "The women Dorothy saw coming to my house. That wasn't a new career. Venture, was it?" Jennifer shook her head. "It was Mary Kay. I became a consultant 6 months ago, trying to earn extra income. I needed a place to hold parties, and our apartment was too small. So you used my living room. I was going to ask permission, but then you went into the hospital. And I thought if I could just get established, maybe I could earn enough to help with the mortgage payments." Margaret felt a strange combination of anger and pity washing over her. These two people had spent 5 years sacrificing their own financial stability to protect her from truths she had a right to know. They had made themselves poor and desperate while trying to be noble. And in their desperation, they had crossed lines that should never have been crossed. "The missing items," Margaret said. "My grandmother's sewing machine, Robert's books, the silver tea service." Michael's face crumpled. "We sold them. I'm so sorry, Mom. We only sold things we thought you wouldn't miss right away, and we kept all the records so we could buy them back if we ever got ahead financially." "You thought I wouldn't miss my grandmother's sewing machine? You haven't used it in 10 years. You thought wrong." Margaret's voice was steady now, cold with a fury that surprised even her. "You thought you had the right to make decisions about my property, my finances, my life, without consulting me. We were trying to help you. By lying to me for 5 years? By stealing from me? By treating me like an invalid who couldn't handle the truth about her own husband and her own home?" Tommy looked up from his Legos, sensing the rising tension in the room. "Mommy, why is Grandma Maggie upset?" "It's okay, sweetheart," Jennifer said quickly, her voice artificially bright. "Grown-ups are just having a discussion." But Margaret was far from done with this discussion. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a clarity that felt almost surgical in its precision. She stood up from the sofa and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked street where she'd lived for 37 years, where she'd raised her son and buried her husband and thought she knew who she could trust. "I want to see everything," she said, turning back to face them. "Every document, every bank statement, every receipt for every item you sold. I want the contact information for every creditor and a complete accounting of every payment you've made on my behalf." "Mom, I'm not finished." Margaret's voice cut through Michael's protest like a blade. "I want to know about the real estate agent Dorothy saw here. I want to know what you were planning to do with my house." Jennifer and Michael exchanged another look, and Margaret realized there was still more they hadn't told her. "What else?" she demanded. "The house is going into foreclosure," Michael said quietly. "We got notice 2 weeks ago. We have 60 days to bring the mortgage current or the bank will take it." The words hit Margaret like a final blow. Everything else, the lies, the theft, the deception, had been building to this moment. Her home, the place where she'd planned to live out her remaining years, where she'd hoped Tommy would bring his own children someday, was going to be lost to the bank because of debts she'd never known existed. "How much do we owe?" "Total, including penalties and interest?" Michael's voice was barely audible. $137,000. Margaret sat back down, hard. The number was staggering, impossible. Even if she sold every possession she had left, even if she cashed in her modest retirement savings, she couldn't come close to that amount. "The real estate agent," she said. "You were planning to sell the house. We thought if we could sell it quickly, before the foreclosure went through, we might be able to pay off the debt and have something left over for you. To start fresh somewhere smaller," Jennifer explained. "Cynthia Morrison said houses in this neighborhood are selling well. She thought we could get maybe $250,000 for it." Margaret did the math in her head. After paying off the mortgage debt and realtor fees, there might be enough left for a small condo somewhere, if she was lucky. If the house sold quickly and for asking price. If there were no other surprises waiting to devastate what remained of her financial security. "You were going to sell my house without telling me." "We were going to tell you after you recovered," Michael said. "We were going to present it as the only option and let you make the final decision. But you'd already started the process." "We had to. The foreclosure clock was ticking." Margaret looked around her living room, seeing it now through different eyes. The rearranged furniture, the updated decor, the carefully staged atmosphere. It had all been preparation for showing the house to potential buyers. Jennifer hadn't been making herself comfortable. She'd been preparing Margaret's home for sale. "Where did you think I would live?" Margaret asked. "There are some nice senior communities in the area," Jennifer said carefully. "Places where you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance and upkeep, where there would be other people your age for companionship." Margaret almost laughed at the absurdity of it. While she was fighting for her life in a hospital bed, her family had been planning to sell her home and move her into assisted living, all for her own good, of course. "And you?" Margaret asked. "Where were you planning to live?" Michael and Jennifer looked at each other again, and Margaret realized she'd asked the question they'd been hoping to avoid. "We thought," Jennifer said hesitantly, "that maybe we could use part of the proceeds from the house sale to put a down payment on something new. Start fresh, all of us together." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This had never been about protecting Margaret from Robert's financial mistakes. This had been about Michael and Jennifer solving their own financial problems by liquidating Margaret's assets. The noble sacrifices, the secret payments, the careful explanations. It had all been leading to this moment when they would convince her that selling her home was the only reasonable option. And they had nearly succeeded. If Margaret hadn't come home early, if she hadn't demanded answers, if she'd been more medicated or confused or trusting, she might have agreed to their plan. She might have believed that losing her home was an inevitable consequence of Robert's hidden debts, rather than a choice her family was making for their own benefit. Margaret stood up again, and this time her movements were deliberate and controlled. She walked to the folder of documents and gathered them into a neat pile. "Get out," she said quietly. "Mom, Get out of my house. Take your son and your lies and your plans for my future, and get out." "Margaret, please," Jennifer pleaded. "Let us help you figure this out. We can't solve it by fighting with each other." "You can't solve it at all," Margaret replied, "because it's not your problem to solve. It's mine." Tommy had stopped playing with his Legos and was looking back and forth between the adults with growing alarm. "Are we leaving, Daddy?" "Yes, sweetheart," Michael said, defeat heavy in his voice. "We're leaving." As they gathered their belongings and prepared to go, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a kind of fierce independence that reminded her of the young woman who had moved to Connecticut alone in 1987, determined to build a life on her own terms. "Michael," she called, as he reached the front door with Tommy's hand in his. He turned back, hope flickering in his eyes. "Don't come back here without calling first, and don't make any more decisions about my life without asking me." After they left, Margaret sat alone in her disrupted living room, surrounded by evidence of her husband's deception and her family's betrayal. The rain had stopped, and pale moonlight filtered through the windows, illuminating the papers scattered across her coffee table like accusations. She had 60 days to save her house, $137,000 to somehow find or earn or borrow, and a family to either forgive or lose forever. But for the first time in weeks, Margaret felt like she was finally awake.